chances are you don't know this country. This is one of the world's richest countries. Their culture, their heritage, and yes, their fortune is unimaginable. And no, this isn't some rich country in Europe. Can you guess where it is? This is Nauru. It's a tiny island country in Micronesia, towards the northeast of Australia. And Nauru was the second richest country in the world for a time, but they lost all their wealth. And I want to explore why that was in this video. But first, let's back up. At its peak, Nauru had a GDP per capita of roughly $50,000 at the time. And this was 5 times richer than that of Switzerland, and 6 times than that of the United States. Nauru residents used to own luxury cars, they went on expensive holidays, they owned luxury items, and they had properties abroad. And to top it all off, life's basic necessities such as electricity, education, and healthcare was all free. To belong to Nauru meant that you had a life of leisure and luxury. But all of this came crashing down in the 90s. As the world entered the new millennium, the GDP per capita was 16 times smaller than what it was in its peak in the 70s. So what happened? How did one of the richest countries in the world end up becoming one of the poorest nations, all within a span of a single generation? So let's look at the history of the country to understand its current state. For many centuries, the few tribes that inhabited the island of Nauru managed a lifestyle with harmony with nature. They would only take as much as needed from the land and never more. And this led to a pretty sustainable lifestyle, and it prevented intertribal conflict. Life would be more or less peaceful in the paradise of the island. But well, that was until the Europeans arrived. On November 8, 1798, a British ship called the Snow Hunter was spotted on the island. The ship's captain was so taken aback by the island's beauty that he named it Pleasant Island. And then, within a few decades, some Europeans, who were mostly fugitives unfortunately, would arrive on the island and they would rule the Nauruan beaches with brutality. You see, over time there was a proliferation of guns and alcohol on the island. Violence and tribal conflict, which were once rare, was now becoming very commonplace on the island. Despite all of this mayhem, this tiny island nation was actually never colonized by European authorities. They simply didn't see it as worthwhile. Well, that was until the discovery of one important mineral, phosphate. In 1899, a geologist by the name of Albert Ellis was inspecting a very mundane-looking rock. And then he discovered that that rock was basically high-grade phosphate ore. Later on, a survey would be conducted, and they would discover that 80% of the entire island was covered in this super fertilizer. And this set off a series of very important events to extract this important mineral. The first to set up a mining operation in Nauru was Germany. However, following World War I, it was overtaken by the British Empire and given to the Dominion of Australia. By the early 1920s, Nauru was exporting some 200,000 metric tons of phosphate a year, and 2 decades later, it became 4 times that amount. Then, in the 1940s, the operation stopped for a while when the Japanese invaded the tiny island nation, brutalizing the country. And then after World War II was over, less than 600 Nauruans were left on the island, and a quarter of the population were dead. After the war, the UN assigned Australia, Britain, and New Zealand to be the trustees for the Nauru nation. But following this, the phosphate mining started to boom again. Over the next 2 decades, exports would steadily rise. In 1968, Nauru would gain its independence, but by then, 35 million metric tons of phosphate was extracted from the country. Now, you might think that the native Nauruan people would be benefiting from these exports, right? But they weren't. At least not until their independence, when they finally gained control over their own island's resources. From here onwards, their GDP growth was explosive. It only took them 7 years after their independence to become the second wealthiest population on the planet. You see, the market infrastructure and the equipment needed to cultivate this phosphate was already in place and was now under the ownership of Nauru. This newfound wealth was spent lavishly. You see, the island nation went on a spending spree, buying up aircrafts, cruise ships, and overseas hotels. Luxury goods were imported, and it was common for residents to own sports car in this tiny island country. Well-paid jobs were guaranteed by the government. Moreover, everything from housing to utilities were either free or subsidized by the state for all citizens. And if you were a top government official, you could also expect frequent golf trips to the Bahamas as a perk. Residents of Nauru literally did not have to worry about throwing money away, because there was more than enough flowing in to fund their opulent lifestyle. Life was great until it wasn't. By the way, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I put out these kinds of videos every single week. By the 90s, phosphate started to run out, and with that, so did the money. To make matters worse, the government had done very little to prepare the country for what was inevitable. Turns out that investing in sports car and luxury hotels doesn't pay the same dividends as investing in citizen education and vocational training. As things started to get difficult, the government tried various attempts to shore up its revenue. It began offering offshore banking services, where you could open an account even if you haven't visited the country. They also offered what was called economic citizenship, where you could obtain their passport for a lump sum amount of money, no questions asked. Now you can probably imagine some of the worst consequences of this. The island ended up becoming a hotspot of criminal activity, and many wealthy individuals and even mafia organizations were using these schemes for tax evasion or money laundering. But even these schemes were not enough to offset the country's financial worries, so the government turned to even more questionable practices. They allowed Australia, of all places, to open up a refugee detention center on their island. Now, whatever measures they took, the fact was the phosphate boom was over, and so were the good times. There was no quick fix that would allow the island to regain its former lifestyle. The tale of Nauru serves as a cautionary tale, one about the importance of good financial management. Good times do not last forever. It's a story that we've seen over and over again in history, and when trouble hits you, you have to be prepared. Nauru was not. There was little effort made by its government to diversify its economy or to upskill its citizens. A decline in the phosphate exports hit the country especially hard. The unemployment rate hit a staggering 90%, and getting a job abroad was not an option for many people because they couldn't either afford to go abroad or they did not have good employable skills. 94% of its population were overweight, but now they had no functioning healthcare to look after them. Now, you might think that the island itself would probably be rich in minerals and resources, but in a weird twist of irony, all that phosphate mining actually made large tracts of the island unsuitable for growing food. Now, if we fast forward a few years, we'll find that the country actually, after hitting rock bottom, managed to make a rebound. Government revenue, for instance, increased by almost tenfold within the last decade, and GDP growth has propelled to middle-income status. It is still not as rich as it was in the 70s, but people now earn enough to live a modest and comfortable life. So the question is, was this the fault of Western colonization and exploitation? There definitely is some truth to that. You see, when a powerful country takes over a small country for the sake of extracting resources, the first thing on the powerful country's mind is not education, healthcare, or reform. When Nauru was brutalized during the time of World War II, their people suffered unspeakable tragedies. That's why I think it's natural that when they saw a financial boom afterwards, they would want to spend that money generously. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not an excuse for poor financial management and government corruption, but you need to see the full history of the country and its context. If there was more emphasis on education, financial responsibility, and better treatment of the native population, then Nauru might have had the tools to manage the wealth that came to them after their independence. I mean, they're totally not off the hook. However, I think history plays a significant role in how it shapes a country's ability to manage its finances. I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. Was Nauru's downfall their own fault, or was it something else? Leave a comment down below and let me know. Anyway, speaking of riches to rags, the story of the Spanish Empire follows a pretty similar trajectory. I made a video about it right over here, so check it out if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.